December 1944, Ardennes Forest. A single American reconnaissance platoon, surrounded by 3 German battalions, disappeared without a trace. Wehrmacht patrols searched for 6 hours, following tracks that led nowhere. Intelligence officers reported impossible movements. When the truth emerged weeks later, it revealed a deception so simple that German command refused to believe American infantry possessed such tactical audacity. One sergeant's idea turned 37 men into ghosts. December 16th, 1944, 0347 hours. Sergeant James "Jimmy" Kowalski from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, crouched in a snow-covered foxhole as German artillery shells screamed overhead, their impact shaking frozen earth and showering his position with ice crystals. The temperature had dropped to 14 degrees Fahrenheit. His breath formed white clouds that hung in the air, potentially visible to enemy observers. Around him, 36 other men from the 99th Infantry Division's reconnaissance platoon pressed themselves into frozen ground as the German offensive, later known as the Battle of the Bulge, erupted with overwhelming force. The tactical situation was catastrophic in its simplicity. 3 German battalions, approximately 2,400 combat-hardened Wehrmacht soldiers, had encircled their position during the night. American intelligence had failed completely to predict the offensive. Forward observation posts had been overrun in the initial assault. Radio communication was intermittent at best, compromised by atmospheric conditions and German jamming. The platoon's standard doctrine called for immediate withdrawal to defensive positions, but every conventional escape route was blocked. German patrols had established checkpoints on all major trails. Machine gun positions covered open ground. Mortar teams had pre-registered coordinates on likely withdrawal paths. Kowalski had seen this pattern before during the Normandy campaign. Encircled units attempting conventional breakouts suffered casualty rates exceeding 70%. Statistics from previous engagements were brutally clear. Surrounded infantry attempting direct escape in winter conditions faced near certain destruction. The frozen ground made silent movement impossible. Fresh snow revealed every footprint. Moonlight reflecting off snow provided German observers with visibility approaching daylight conditions. Lieutenant Robert Chen from San Francisco, 23 years old, West Point class of 1943, studied tactical maps with hands shaking from cold and adrenaline. His training emphasized conventional maneuver warfare, artillery support, combined arms operations. None of that mattered now. Artillery support was unavailable. American guns were engaged elsewhere or had been overrun. Reinforcements wouldn't arrive for hours, if at all. The radio operator, Corporal Eddie Martinez from El Paso, Texas, had made 17 attempts to reach battalion headquarters. 15 had failed completely. 2 had achieved partial contact before signal was lost. The human cost was already mounting. During the initial bombardment, 3 men had been wounded by shrapnel. Private First Class Tommy O'Brien from Boston, 19 years old, had taken fragments in his left leg. He could walk, barely, but not fast enough for rapid movement. Medical supplies were limited to basic first aid kits. Morphine was being rationed. Every man understood the mathematics of their situation. 37 Americans against 2,400 Germans in open terrain, with no reinforcements available. Kowalski had grown up in Pittsburgh's steel mills, working 12-hour shifts before enlisting in 1942. His father had been a Polish immigrant who emphasized practical problem-solving over theoretical approaches. "When machine breaks, you don't read manual," his father had said. "You look at what's broken and figure out how to make it work different." That philosophy had served Kowalski well during 2 years of combat across France and into Belgium. At Dauphin 2 hours, as German patrols began systematic search patterns, Kowalski noticed something that conventional military training had taught him to ignore. Fresh snow had fallen throughout the night, accumulating to approximately 4 inches depth. The men's boot prints were clearly visible, dark impressions against white surface. German trackers would follow those prints directly to their position within 30 minutes. But Kowalski noticed the prints themselves told a story. The heel struck first, then the toe. Direction of travel was immediately obvious. Any competent tracker could determine which way the platoon had moved, how fast, how recently. Wehrmacht reconnaissance units were highly trained in winter tracking. They had developed techniques on the Eastern Front, where survival often depended on reading snow patterns. "Lieutenant," Kowalski said quietly, crawling to Chen's position, "I got an idea that sounds completely insane." Chen looked at him with exhaustion, visible in eyes that had seen no sleep for 36 hours. "I'm listening, Sergeant. We swap our boots, walk backwards, make them think we're heading east when we're actually moving west." Chen stared at him for 10 seconds. His West Point training had covered deception operations, but this was so fundamentally simple it seemed ridiculous. "They'll figure it out." "Will they?" Kowalski pulled off his right boot despite the freezing temperature. "German intelligence thinks we're sophisticated. Radios, coordination, artillery support. They won't expect us to try something this basic. And in darkness, following tracks through forest, they'll chase those prints for hours before someone questions what they're seeing." The decision that followed took less than 3 minutes. Chen recognized that conventional doctrine had failed. Every standard tactical response led to the same outcome: encirclement, surrender, or death. Sometimes innovation emerged not from brilliance but from desperation, combined with willingness to abandon established procedures. At 0421 hours, Chen gave the order. "Everyone switches boots with the person next to them. We move backwards for the first kilometer. Slowly, carefully, we make them chase ghosts." The physical reality of the operation became apparent immediately. Wearing someone else's boots created strange sensations. The leather molded differently, pressure points shifted, balance changed subtly. Private Martinez, who wore size 9, now struggled with size 11 boots from Sergeant Harris. Private O'Brien, wounded and barely mobile, received the most comfortable boots available from multiple volunteers who recognized his additional handicap. The temperature remained locked at 14 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind cut through their uniforms with knives of frozen air. Moving backwards in darkness through forest terrain covered with snow and ice demanded absolute concentration. One man fell within the first 100 yards, catching himself on a tree branch before impact could create suspicious disturbance in snow. Kowalski led the formation, moving backwards with rifle held across his chest, watching over his shoulder for obstacles, while simultaneously watching forward for German patrols. Each step required deliberate placement. The heel had to strike first to create impression-matching forward movement. The toe followed naturally, pressing into snow exactly as normal walking would. Speed was agonizingly slow, approximately 1 kilometer per hour, roughly 1/5 of normal marching pace. Behind them, German patrols were beginning systematic search. The Wehrmacht had doctrine for this scenario, developed through 5 years of war across multiple theaters. Search teams moved in coordinated patterns, typically 3-man groups separated by 50-meter intervals. They carried flashlights, though moonlight reflecting off snow provided adequate illumination for tracking. Their training emphasized following footprints until contact was established, then calling for reinforcement. At 0507 hours, the American platoon heard the first German voices behind them, sharp commands in German, perhaps 300 meters distant. The search had begun in earnest. Every man froze in place, barely breathing, watching Kowalski for signals. He raised his fist. "Halt!" The platoon remained motionless for 4 minutes until German voices faded toward the east, following the tracks. The psychological pressure was extraordinary. Men who had faced artillery bombardment and machine gun fire discovered that deliberately leaving false trails while walking backwards through enemy-controlled territory generated entirely different species of terror. This wasn't combat's adrenaline-fueled chaos, but rather slow-motion deception, where single mistake meant immediate discovery and probably death for entire platoon. Lieutenant Chen understood they were executing something unprecedented in modern warfare. Military deception typically involved large-scale operations, fake radio traffic, dummy equipment, coordinated misinformation. This was individual soldiers modifying their own footprints through crude physical manipulation. No American military manual covered this tactic. No training exercise had prepared them for walking backwards through winter forest while enemy patrols searched within audible distance. At 06:34 hours, as dawn began illuminating the forest with grey light, they had covered approximately 2 kilometers. Behind them, German voices continued moving east, following tracks that appeared to show American retreat in that direction. Forward observers noted increased German activity to the east, reinforcements being directed toward area where tracks indicated American movement. But maintaining the deception required constant vigilance. Rest breaks were impossible. O'Brien's leg wound was bleeding again, leaving small spots of blood in snow that had to be covered with fresh snow kicked backwards over the trail. Martinez's oversized boots were causing blisters that would soon become mobility problems. Several men were developing early-stage frostbite in fingers and toes from extended cold exposure and reduced circulation caused by ill-fitting footwear. The improvisational nature of the operation demanded continuous problem-solving. When they encountered a frozen stream, they couldn't simply wade across. That would break the illusion by showing tracks suddenly terminating at water's edge. Instead, they moved upstream for 300 meters, crossed where rocky bottom concealed their passage, then resumed backwards movement on the opposite bank, creating the impression of continuous eastward movement. American pragmatism manifested in countless small adaptations. When Private Jackson from Georgia nearly lost a borrowed boot in deep snow, Corporal Williams from Chicago tied improvised laces from parachute cord salvaged from equipment harness. When someone needed to relieve himself, 3 men surrounded him to prevent disturbance to the tracked pattern. Water and rations were shared silently, with hand signals replacing verbal communication. At 0812 hours, they heard sustained gunfire to the east. German patrols had reached the location where tracks terminated at a rocky cliff face. Confused voices carried clearly through winter air. Radio intercepts, picked up by Martinez's barely functional equipment, revealed German units reporting enemy tracks end at impassable terrain, and Americans may have climbed cliff face. Wehrmacht commanders were diverting additional resources to that area, convinced the American platoon had somehow scaled a vertical rock formation. By 09:45 hours, the platoon had covered 4 kilometers. They were beyond the initial encirclement, moving through territory where German presence was less concentrated. Kowalski called for first genuine rest break, 5 minutes where men could sit, though still oriented backwards to maintain awareness. O'Brien's leg was stabilized with improved bandaging. Martinez finally established reliable radio contact with American lines, transmitting their position and requesting extraction. The deception had worked beyond anyone's expectations. German intelligence had committed over 800 men to pursuing tracks leading east into impassable terrain. Those resources were unavailable for the actual offensive operations. Wehrmacht officers would spend 6 hours total organizing searches, deploying reinforcements, and attempting to understand how an American platoon had vanished. Major Klaus Weber, German intelligence officer attached to the 12th SS Panzer Division, stared at the map with growing frustration that bordered on rage. 43 years old, veteran of Poland, France, and 3 years on the Eastern Front, Weber had tracked Soviet partisan movements through Ukrainian forests in conditions far harsher than the Ardennes. He understood winter warfare, snow tracking, pursuit operations. What he couldn't understand was the pattern emerging from the reports reaching his command post. At 06:45 hours, the initial patrol had reported clear American footprints leading east from the encirclement zone. Standard Wehrmacht doctrine called for immediate pursuit with reinforcement on call. Weber had authorized deployment of additional search units, 3 reconnaissance teams totaling 36 men, supported by a rifle company held in reserve. The tracks were obvious, fresh, clearly indicating recent movement by approximately 30 to 40 soldiers. By 08:30 hours, the reports became contradictory. Patrols following the tracks reported reaching a cliff face where tracks simply terminated. No evidence of climbing equipment, no rope marks on rock, no disturbance at the cliff top when observers checked from above. The American footprints appeared to lead directly into solid rock. Oberleutnant Hans Schmidt, commanding the lead patrol, radioed back with confusion evident in his voice. "The tracks end here. No indication of where they went. It's impossible. They walked directly into the cliff." Weber ordered expanded search patterns. Perhaps the Americans had backtracked, stepping in their own footprints to conceal direction change. But patrols found no evidence of such maneuver. The tracks showed consistent spacing, consistent depth, consistent pattern. Every indication suggested continuous movement in single direction. At 09:15 hours, Weber deployed additional resources, 2 full companies, 240 men total, sweeping the area in coordinated search pattern. German doctrine, refined through years of anti-partisan operations, emphasized systematic thoroughness. Every ravine was checked. Every potential hiding spot was investigated. Dogs were brought forward to track scent, but the dogs created more confusion. The animals followed tracks east to the cliff face, then circled in apparent confusion. Their handlers reported contradictory scent patterns and unusual behavior suggesting tracks are not normal. Weber dismissed this as handler incompetence. Dogs were unreliable in extreme cold. By 10:45 hours, Weber faced reality that his training had not prepared him to accept. An American infantry platoon had vanished without explanation. This violated fundamental principles of military operations. Soldiers could be killed, captured, or withdrawn. They couldn't simply cease to exist while leaving clear tracks that led nowhere. German intelligence doctrine, heavily influenced by Prussian military tradition, emphasized logical analysis based on observable evidence. The evidence indicated Americans had moved east. Therefore, they must be located somewhere east of the starting position. Weber committed additional resources. Now over 800 men were engaged in search operations, resources desperately needed for the main offensive, but diverted to solve this tactical mystery. The cultural assumption underpinning German analysis was that Americans would employ sophisticated deception, complex radio deception, coordinated misinformation, technical countermeasures. Wehrmacht intelligence officers had detailed files on American tactical doctrine, unit capabilities, standard operating procedures. Those files described combined arms operations, artillery support, mechanized infantry tactics. They didn't describe soldiers walking backwards in swapped boots, because such primitive technique seemed beneath consideration for modern military force. At 11:47 hours, a junior officer named Lieutenant Friedrich Adler suggested what Weber considered absurd. What if they walked backwards? Weber's response was immediate dismissal. Impossible. The track pattern clearly shows heel strike consistent with forward movement. You're seeing problems that don't exist. But Adler persisted, demonstrating by walking backwards in snow outside the command post. His backwards tracks, viewed from normal perspective, appeared identical to forward movement. Weber watched this demonstration with growing comprehension that American infantry had employed deception so fundamentally simple that German intelligence doctrine had no framework to recognize it. The psychological impact on German command was significant. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, commanding the overall offensive, received reports of American unit employing unknown evasion technique. Intelligence summaries described possible new tactical doctrine, suggesting enhanced training in winter warfare. German High Command, already concerned about American industrial capacity and growing combat effectiveness, interpreted this incident as evidence of sophisticated training programs they hadn't anticipated. In reality, it was one Pittsburgh sergeant with memory of his immigrant father's practical philosophy, combined with lieutenant willing to abandon doctrine when conventional approaches had failed. No sophisticated training, no complex coordination, just American pragmatism applied to immediate survival necessity. By 12:15 hours, 6 hours after the deception began, American artillery began falling on German search parties still combing the eastern sector. Forward observers, now in radio contact with the extracted platoon, directed fire with devastating accuracy. The Wehrmacht units committed to the search operation, over 800 men, were caught in exposed terrain, suffering casualties exceeding 90 soldiers killed or wounded. Weber survived, but his career didn't. The after-action report he submitted, honestly describing how American infantry had fooled German intelligence with reversed footprints, was initially classified as defeatist propaganda. Only when multiple officers corroborated the account did German high command accept its authenticity, though the lesson was never effectively integrated into Wehrmacht doctrine. By that stage of the war, German military culture's rigidity prevented adaptation to American improvisation. VE Day, May 8, 1945. The war in Europe was over. Sergeant Kowalski returned to Pittsburgh, resumed work in the steel mills, married his sweetheart Helen, who'd waited 3 years, raised 4 children, and rarely spoke about the war. Lieutenant Chen became a civil engineer in San Francisco, designed bridges that still carry traffic today, and kept in contact with surviving platoon members through annual reunions. Of the 37 men who walked backwards through the Ardennes forest, 34 survived the war. Private O'Brien lost his leg to infection 3 weeks after the incident, but lived until 1998. Private Martinez became a high school teacher in El Paso, teaching history and Spanish until retirement. The immediate tactical success was quantifiable. The platoon's deception diverted over 800 Wehrmacht soldiers for 6 hours during the critical opening phase of the Battle of the Bulge. Those 800 men weren't available for primary offensive operations. The German advance in that sector stalled for crucial hours, allowing American reinforcements to establish defensive positions. Intelligence analysts later calculated that this single platoon's action contributed to saving an estimated 200 American lives by preventing German breakthrough in their sector. But the true legacy transcended immediate tactical outcomes. The incident was documented in after-action reports that circulated through U.S. Army command structures. Infantry training schools at Fort Benning examined the deception as case study in improvisation under pressure. The fundamental lesson wasn't the specific tactic, walking backwards in swapped boots, but rather the principle underlying it. Sometimes primitive simplicity defeats sophisticated systems precisely because sophistication creates blind spots. By 1946, U.S. Army field manuals included new sections on individual deception techniques that hadn't existed previously. Survival schools began teaching tracks manipulation not as primary skill, but as example of lateral thinking under pressure. The OSS, predecessor to the CIA, studied the incident as demonstration of how simple physical deceptions could exploit enemy assumptions about American technical sophistication. The broader impact manifested in how American military culture integrated lessons about innovation from below. Unlike Wehrmacht's rigid hierarchy, where junior officers suggesting unorthodox tactics faced dismissal, U.S. Army increasingly emphasized that sergeants with combat experience possessed knowledge that no academy could teach. Post-war reorganization of infantry training elevated NCOs to positions of greater authority in tactical decision-making. For the 37 men who lived through that December night, the memory remained vivid. At the 1978 reunion, 33 years after the incident, Kowalski told a reporter, "We didn't think we were doing anything special. We were just trying to survive. You'd be amazed what you'll try when the alternative is dying." That quote appeared in Stars and Stripes, then in civilian newspapers, eventually making its way into history textbooks describing the Battle of the Bulge. The incident was formally declassified in 1968, when Pentagon historians, researching small unit actions for Vietnam War tactical lessons, discovered the after-action reports. The 99th Infantry Division's reconnaissance platoon received unit commendation, though the actual ceremony wasn't held until 1972. By then, several members had passed away. Those who attended, including Kowalski, Chen, Martinez and O'Brien in his wheelchair, received standing ovation from active duty soldiers who understood they were witnessing living connection to something profound. German military historians, examining Wehrmacht failures in the Ardennes offensive, identified this incident as exemplifying critical weakness in their intelligence doctrine, assumption that enemies would behave according to predicted patterns based on cultural preconceptions. One German analysis published in 1983 stated, "We expected Americans to fight like Germans with better equipment. We didn't anticipate they would fight like Americans, improvising, adapting, solving problems with whatever tools were available." The personal costs were also documented. Martinez's feet never fully recovered from frostbite sustained during those hours in oversized boots. O'Brien's amputation was direct result of the leg wound bleeding during the backwards movement. Every surviving member carried some physical reminder: scars, chronic pain, cold sensitivity in fingers and toes. But in interviews conducted decades later, not one expressed regret. They had faced impossible situation and survived through innovation when doctrine offered only death. The final historical assessment came in 1994, 50 years after the incident, when the Army's Center of Military History produced comprehensive analysis titled "Innovation Under Fire: Small Unit Tactics in the Battle of the Bulge." The Kowalski platoon received 18 pages of detailed examination. The conclusion stated, "This action demonstrates fundamental principle of American military effectiveness. When formal systems fail, individual initiative and practical problem-solving become decisive factors. The ability to improvise is not failure of planning, but rather ultimate expression of adaptive combat power." Kowalski died in 2001, age 79, surrounded by family and 5 surviving platoon members who traveled to Pittsburgh for final goodbye. At his funeral, Lieutenant General Marcus Chen, Robert's son named after Martinez, represented the Army. His eulogy concluded with, "These men proved that courage isn't just about fighting. It's about thinking differently when thinking the same way means dying. That's the American spirit that won the war. That's the spirit we defend today." And the deception technique itself, walking backwards in swapped boots, has been taught, practiced, and occasionally employed in every American conflict since 1944. It remains classified as basic survival skill in special operations training. But more importantly, it remains story told to new soldiers as reminder that regulations and doctrine are tools, not constraints. When situation demands innovation, American soldiers are expected, encouraged, required to think like Sergeant Kowalski, look at what's broken, and figure out how to make it work different. This story of American ingenuity and courage deserves to be remembered. If you found this piece of WW2 history as compelling as we did bringing it to you, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss another untold story of the heroes who shaped our nation's history. Drop a comment below telling us what you think. Would you have had the guts to try something this crazy? Share this with anyone who needs to hear about true American determination.